Hello, Kathy here, and I have some paintings and, in this case, a drawing, a bunch of images to show you to get you thinking about how artists have responded to the human presence, how they have evoked that feeling of the figure, and the different attitudes that artists have often taken towards the figure, certainly our most interesting of all subjects. So we're going to start off with the classic situation of the model in the studio. Obviously, when people begin to draw the figure, they need to study that in most cases, and they have classically worked from human models because of our patriarchal world and the societies that this practice has arisen in. It's often been male artists and female models. So I thought I'd start with this wonderful Rembrandt drawing, the nude model in Rembrandt's studio. And here you see a bunch of guys chastely clustered at quite a good distance from the nude model. And it looks like a few women up in the balcony there, sort of keeping an eye on things. And they are observing the model very, very closely and obviously really trying to learn to draw here. The model in the studio typically, you'll see that the artists tend to be much more fully dressed, and the models, if they are not nude, tend to be very loosely and lightly dressed. The idea being, of course, that it's important to study human anatomy. Daumier, who was a cartoonist as well as a painter, obviously thought that there might be other things going on in the studio besides pure anatomy study. This situation, the fully dressed man and the naked woman, uh, is something that we've gotten quite used to seeing in the studio. This painting of Manet's, of course, shows us that relationship in all its oddity, simply by taking that situation and moving it from the studio to a picnic lunch. Modern day painters of the model in the studio are a bit fewer. This is a choice, of course, that any painter can make, but to make a career of painting the model in the studio as opposed to using that as a study to make your figure painting better, that's a fairly unusual choice these days. Philip Pearlstein is the artist that really comes to mind, who's done many, many paintings of the model in the studio. In a recent series of paintings, he has paired them with still life items that are sort of imbued with a real pop culture feel. He has been accused of painting the figure basically as if it were a still life object, and you can see a little bit of that going on in these paintings, with the flesh painted in very much the same way that the plastic dinosaur is painted. Very frank, very clinical almost, and with an attitude that really makes us feel that these models are models. They are not necessarily individual people that he knows and loves, for example. Degas is well known for figure paintings that move the models out of the studio and into more believable spaces. And because he's such a master at this, I can't resist showing you at least one Degas here. This is figure painting at its very finest, I think. Again, you see the one male in the painting is completely fully clad, and the dancers, of course, are much more loosely and lightly clothed. But there's a reason for it, right? This is a ballet rehearsal, and so they're all in costume. One has to suspect that Degas chose to paint ballet dancers because of their loose, light clothing, their athletic and graceful poses. It gave him these beautiful visual subjects that he could show off his amazing talents with gesture and anatomy and perspective, as well as color and paint handling. Wonderful painting of the figure in this very, very convincing deep space, many figures. This painting by Mary Cassatt, a friend and contemporary and co-worker with Degas, takes an attitude towards the figure that pushes even past that group of dancers. This young girl is probably well known to Cassatt, probably a family member or the daughter of a friend. She's sitting in a real space, which Cassatt brushes in very quickly but very, very convincingly, so that we really get the feeling of an intimate sort of portrait. This girl is not just a model. She is someone well known to the artist and is depicted in a much more tender way. And about the same time period, Berthe Morisot, also a contemporary and associate of Cassatt and Degas, painted this, I'm convinced, sitting in the other side of the rowboat. It looks to me like she was painting just as fast as she could, and I can almost hear the splashing of those ducks in the water on the right side there. The young women who were in the boat with her, I'm convinced, were not models. They are not still life objects like Pearlstein's models. They are people she knows. They happen to be available, they happen to be willing, and she is painting them as quickly as she can because she's got them now. Sargent, of course, painted many, many of his friends and family members. He hired models in the studio as well, but he often would simply go out on a picnic and bring all his painting gear with him while his friends strolled the riverbanks or napped in the shade. He produced many, many quick oil paintings, beautiful watercolors of his friends. I particularly love this one. The foliage in the background is painted with so much bravura brushwork. Really looks like he was having fun. The upside down sky behind the woman reflected there so brilliantly. It just gives a sense of humor to me to this painting. Very much a record of a moment, although it had to take him more than just a few moments to paint this. He somehow captured the feeling of that bright, sunny morning. Painted in the same year as The Sergeant. This is by Vincent van Gogh, a painting of Augustine Roulin. It's called La Berceuse, and it means the lullaby. She was rocking a cradle by that rope as she sat for him. She sat for him for 6 or 8 paintings in almost this identical pose. They're quite different in the way they handle the coloring, the brushwork, and especially the pattern of the wallpaper behind her, which, as you see in this particular Berceuse, is a really, really active, popping, wild pattern that competes very vigorously with the painting of the woman herself. She seems very serene and reserved next to her wallpaper. Very, very beautiful portrait that, although it's a portrait, I really feel that we're seeing as much of Van Gogh in this as we are of Augustine Roulin. And here is a portrait right about the same time of Dr. Gachet by Van Gogh. And again, we feel that whatever that is in the background behind him, it seems to me that it's sky and hills and that he's sitting probably at an outdoor table. There's some foxglove in the little cup there. But although it's probably miles away, instead of being right behind him as the background in the previous painting, we still really get that feeling that it's up in our face. Van Gogh is not interested in letting us see atmospheric perspective and the depth of the space he can create. He really is interested in paint. He wants us to look at the surface of the painting that he's painting and the activity and the expression that he has in those marks. They work their way into the jacket, they work their way even into the face and the hands, that very, very active brushwork. Here, just a few years later, we see a painting of a model by Gustav Klimt that is quite realistic. The flesh and the likeness are very, very carefully modeled. The thing that is so striking about this painting, of course, is that the values in the model have been lowered so cautiously and carefully, and the values in the slightly darker background have been kept so carefully similar to the shadows in the painting that the whole thing seems to almost have a veil over it or to be knit into one level surface. That gray background is all of a piece with the portrait. And again, you see painters giving themselves the permission to do this, to use the background as a part of their expression, their painting, to keep our eyes on that instead of giving us an illusion of deep space, as Degas might have done, or Manet. And just a few years later here, Klimt has gone so far in that direction that the face seems to be peering at us out of this swirling fabric of patterns, almost as if Adele Bloch-Bauer is being consumed by this wall of swirling patterns. Very, very beautiful piece, very different from any of the paintings that you've seen so far. Frida Kahlo, of course, is very well known for her self-portraits. She takes an attitude towards the space that she's creating and the things that she puts in the painting with her that is much more surreal or dreamlike, I think. We feel that those monkeys are there. We feel that kind of flaming bird of paradise plant or whatever it is behind her, we feel that those are there for some symbolic or expressive reason, even though we can't be sure exactly what that is. We can't perhaps put it exactly into words. She's not painting those things because she happened to be standing in a room with plants and a bunch of monkeys came in and began cuddling on her shoulders. She's put them there. She's chosen, she's placed them there, she's imagined them there, right, for expressive reasons. And this, again, is a very different attitude towards presenting the figure and letting us know where that figure is or what its relationship is to the things around it in the rectangle of the painting. We see Lucian Freud in the very same year taking a very similar attitude in a very different kind of painting. He paints himself with a cityscape, I suppose you'd say, that is very flattened and graphic. It's not, there isn't a real attempt for it to be literal or realistic, although he intends us to read the space. I mean, the fact that there's this big, vast plane that goes back into an empty, dark, negative shape seems to give a feeling of loneliness to the piece. The fact that there is a building there and that there are critters in the windows, a little bird, a little gnome-like figure in the windows, those things seem to be important, but in a way that we can't really put into words, in a sort of dreamlike way. He's using the feather in his hand, the pose, the look on his face, everything there is meant to evoke a feeling, right, that probably goes beyond a physical portrait and tries to let us into his psyche in some way. Here's another portrait by Lucian Freud, 50 years later. And although this one is extremely depictive, I mean, I feel like I'd recognize him by this painting if I saw him on the street more than I would have the first one. It seems in some ways more skillful in its realistic rendering of the human form. And yet, he's back to the model in the studio. He's showing himself as if he were a model, and certainly literally in the studio. But it's with a difference. Look at the way the floor has been painted. Look at the way the face has been painted. The paint is very, very front and center. It is scabby, it is slimy, it is put on with fingers, it is put on with knives, it is scraped back and painted over and piled up. He really is so skillfully playing with this line between depiction, really pointing at the subject, and the energy of the paint expression, really pointing at him. He is the subject, of course, and it's especially powerful in this self-portrait. In this painting by Jane Maxwell, she has completely abandoned any effort to create three-dimensional space. Even the overlapping of these figures is contradicted by the fact that they interpenetrate each other so that you can't really tell what's in front and what's behind. And it almost looks to me as if she has used two or three stencils and flipped them over and repeated them. I see several of the figures seeming to be made from the same pattern, maybe inverted, outlined as if she were painting around a literal stencil that she had made. And this way of responding to the human figure by looking at the form, by flattening it, by imagining a different way of depicting it that doesn't refer to the individual, right, is another way to respond to the human presence. Alfredo Arguin also does not attempt to create any real space. His paintings, although they're not always figure paintings, but in this case we have one, shatter the figure into these beautiful, tiny, glowing tesserae that almost look like a mosaic or a stained glass window. The approach here reminds me of that Adele Bloch-Bauer painting by Gustav Klimt of the woman with the bright golden patterns swirling all around her. Very similarly, in this painting, the face is fairly clear and legible, but the figure dissolves into these swirling patterns. Mickalene Thomas creates paintings in an interesting way by taking her own photographs, collaging them together into a composition that she likes and wants to work with, and then painting a picture of that. So that in, I can't read French, but Tomica in a chaise longue with Monet, you can see in the original photos that she took that are collaged together that there were a bunch of Monet reproductions on the wall, and she has turned those into blocks of pure color in her painting. Again, a reference to a realistic space, but no effort to make it deep in 3D. Similarly, Kehinde Wiley works in a super realistic style with his figures, typically Americans right off the street, often wearing street clothes, although he often does paint celebrities as well. As far as I know, always Black Americans. And he has often put them in the poses of the heroic poses of that were typical in art historical paintings, but he also often works with these very, very detailed patterns, often fruit, flowers, just wonderful, glorious, reveling in the detail and the color in his patterns. In a way, I think that contrasts with the street clothing and the very intense gaze often of his models. Nothing light and decorative about the model himself here, and the light and decorative background, I think, really strikes that contrast. He has a very well-known painting of Barack Obama that you may have seen. And again, although the figure is painted super realistically, and the leaves and ivy and flowers in the background are painted super realistically, we still don't get the feeling that he's trying to create a real space. We get the feeling that he wants you to come up and put your nose in his painting and observe the wonderful detail and be penetrated by the gaze of his model. Benon Lutaya is well, he was, unfortunately. He died quite young of cancer recently, but was just a wonderful artist living, I believe, in Uganda, or maybe born in Uganda and living in South Africa. Anyway, he worked in collage, and to me, this is such a painterly use of this medium that it completely qualifies as a painting. I don't see what the point would be of not looking at this kind of work to talk about the human presence. This, again, reminds me a little bit of the Arguin or of the Klimt in the way that the patterns and the strokes and tesserae of this kind of junky paper are turned into this glowing, evanescent, ephemeral portrait of what seems to be a child here. I wanted to just go back to the model in the studio for a moment and quickly show you three paintings, or works rather, by a master of the human figure and of paint and of color, Henri Matisse. These were painted throughout a long, long life of incredibly hard work. And I just want you to see the way his attitude towards the figure changed from this very early study, probably in his student days, of a model in the studio, right? Using a repeated mark. This is, the world is just coming out of the invention of Impressionism, and you can see the influence there of those dots of color combining optically, painted very, very rapidly from life. This is about 18 years later, and another painting of the model in the studio, but this time the studio is at least as important as the model. The color that he's chosen, the deep space that he's creating in some ways by his depiction, but also the slight flattening of the space that you get because of his breaking of some perspective rules and so forth. And then the model almost seems like a second thought. She's so small. She's painted rather brusquely, and the whole space just dances and makes me feel that he loved being in his studio and painting the model. And of course, this is towards the end of his life. He became bedridden towards the end of his life and could no longer paint. So he would have assistants paint papers for him, the colors that he wanted to use, and then he would simply use scissors and cut out the forms he wanted. He would arrange them on the wall with long sticks or get his assistants to arrange them for him. And some of these, I think, are just so beautiful. I can't get enough of looking at his cutouts. So another response to the human figure, distorting it, tangling it up, curling it around itself, abstracting it, looking for ways to express its essence, its beauty, its elegance, its importance. Very, very simple, just breathtaking to me. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about evoking the human presence without a human there. And Edward Hopper is the person I first think of. This painting of his makes me feel that there must be humans, and where are they? It's obviously very early morning. I'm thinking any minute now a human will walk along and open one of these storefronts or open one of those windows and hang out with a coffee cup in her hand. I think that the pure emptiness here of the scene evokes the human presence very beautifully. This is a fairly early painting of his. I'm going to just show you a couple more very quickly. I think that ability to show those empty spaces and to care about them and to show them simply and beautifully gives him the ability to fill a whole canvas with throbbing electric meaning and feeling, even though the human, who you would think would be the subject of the painting, is barely shown. He's partly concealed, he's very, very tiny. He's not an afterthought by any means, but he doesn't get much acreage in this painting, and the whole painting is important. That left pine tree on the far side is just as important as anything else, right? The whole feeling of this painting depends on that ability to somehow imbue that landscape, that gas station, that pavement, that road with the feeling that we want a human to be present there. Here too, in his arguably most famous painting, Nighthawks, the sense of loneliness here is very, very similar to that early Sunday morning painting, right? It's a similar street. We're seeing it in 2-point perspective instead of 1 point now, but you see the figures painted not like portraits, but more like, it's almost a documentary way of painting them. They are recorded as figures, they are observed, they're part of the street scene, they're part of the night, they're part of the kind of lonely feeling that we get as we look at this. Wilhelm Hammershøi, a Danish painter, imbued his paintings with a very, very similar feeling of, it's very difficult to put this feeling into words. I don't want to say loneliness so much, but the feeling that the room is there for the human. The room is this glowing container, and it's worthy of being painted in all its specific glory. The shadows on the curtain, the light on the floor. His figures almost always have their back to us because I think he wants us really to focus on the fact of the room itself and the human presence that it either contains or simply evokes. Here's another Hammer Shoy in which you almost get a stronger feeling of the evocation of the person who lives in this house, the person whose drawing room this is. Where are they? Where is that person? So I do think, I'm going to end with this Diebenkorn here, and I do think there are great possibilities for evoking the human presence without actually literally painting the human figure. In this Diebenkorn, the open door, the empty chair, the faraway parking lot that a person could have walked out and walked through, they all speak to me of someone who has perhaps just left, or someone that I'm waiting for their arrival. So you might think about how you could respond to the human figure or evoke a feeling of the human presence, either by depicting the figure itself or by leaving it out, by depicting other things. An interesting approach, but I think a very effective one and very poetic here. Have fun with this.